All right, with our recording going, I want to welcome you all officially, formally to this wonderful webinar today, Raising Caring Men, how #MeToo is bringing a revolution in masculinities. My name is Sarah Saltee. I'm the Director of Leadership and Learning Programs at the Center for Partnership Studies. We're just all delighted to have you with us today for this timely and really critically important conversation about where we are at this time in history in terms of shifting meanings and practices of gender, and what we can do to support the kinds of shifts that will enable us as human beings to devote our attention to the things that matter most: our loving relationships, good work, and a healthy, thriving planet. Once more, for those of you who have just joined us, I want to offer just a couple technical notes. We do have everyone on mute today, so we won't be able to hear your voices. But please do find your chat function and share with us as the webinar unfolds today your thoughts and comments and questions. We'll get to as many of your questions as we can after some opening remarks, and we'll look forward to bringing those forward for discussion by Ron and Riane and Gary a little bit later. So it's my great pleasure to start out today by introducing you to our moderator for today's conversation, Ron LeGrand. Just a little bit about Ron. He serves on the board of directors of Promundo and is an attorney licensed to practice law in Pennsylvania and the District of Columbia. He's also CEO of the LeGrand Group, which provides consulting services with a focus on gender-based violence, legislative affairs, and criminal justice reform. Ron has co-authored a Domestic Violence Awareness Month op-ed for Ebony, appeared on Prince George County, Maryland cable television programming regarding domestic violence, and was one of several planners and presenters at the recent Band of Brothers event for engaging men in conversations on domestic violence, sexual assault, and healthy masculinity. Ron's career includes 20 years in federal service, including chief investigator and counsel to the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee and counsel to the House Judiciary Committee, where he served as the lead Democratic counsel of Bipartisan Congressional Staff Working Group and convened meetings with advocates regarding the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women's Act, Violence Against Women Act, and the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which were signed into law on March 7th, 2013. So it's my honor and privilege to welcome you, Ron, and let you take it away from here.
Well, thank you, and welcome again to all who have signed on to join us. This webinar is a long overdue revolution and conversation, and at the outset, I'm imploring everyone in attendance to resolve now to continue this conversation, to initiate it within your circles and even outside of your circles. Caring men are also healthy men. Men who are free of the rigid definitions of masculinity and strength. They are men who are engaged in redefining these terms in a way that promotes true strength, fosters caring and respect, and an ability to be open and perhaps even vulnerable. Caring men are redefining the term man up. Caring men are not afraid to defy and reject notions and behaviors of dominating and exploiting and objectifying women. Caring men are not afraid to show affection and emotion. Caring men will stand up for women, refusing to stand by and simply observe any form of abuse of women and children. Caring men will raise their sons to respect women and girls as equals. When we succeed in raising caring men, we will begin to witness an end to the abuses that have brought us to this #MeToo moment. When we succeed in raising caring men, we will see a decline in the mass shootings that have become too frequent. Witness Parkland, Las Vegas, Columbine, Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Newtown, and too many others. So how do we get to this kind of success? What does it take to shift the culture of masculinity so that caring men are valued and honored? Today, we're turning to Gary Barker and Riane Eisler, two people who have devoted their careers to exploring ways to think about and achieve gender equity, to help us open up the conversation about how we can move forward. Riane Eisler, JD, is internationally known as a systems scientist, attorney working for the human rights of women and children, and author of groundbreaking books such as The Chalice and the Blade, Our History, Our Future, now in 26 foreign editions, and The Real Wealth of Nations, Creating a Caring Economics. Dr. Eisler has received many honors, including honorary PhDs and Peace and Human Rights Awards. She lectures worldwide with venues including the United Nations General Assembly, the US Department of State, congressional briefings, universities, corporations, conference keynotes, and events hosted by heads of state. Riane is president of the Center for Partnership Studies, in parentheses, CPS, dedicated to research and education on social and economic transformation. She's co-founder of CPS's Caring Economy campaign, and with Nobel Peace Laureate Betty Williams, also co-founder of the Spiritual Alliance to Stop Intimate Violence, SAIV, and editor-in-chief of the Interdisciplinary Journal of Partnership Studies, an online peer-reviewed journal housed at the University of Minnesota that was inspired by Eisler's work. Welcome, Riane. Gary Barker is CEO and founder of Promundo, which has worked for 20 years in more than 35 countries to engage men and boys in achieving gender equality and ending violence against women and girls. Promundo currently has offices in Brazil, the US, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and representation in Europe. Gary is also the co-founder of Men Care, a global campaign working in more than 40 countries to promote men's involvement as equitable, nonviolent caregivers, and co-founder of Men Engaged, a global alliance of more than 600 NGOs and UN agencies. Gary holds a doctorate in child development. Welcome, Gary.
Thank you, Ron. Sarah, just to do a check, is my microphone working all right?
Yes, it is.
Great. I'm going to use a couple of images because I think seeing pictures of caring men helps us think a little bit about what we're aspiring for. I want to start off my remarks with reflecting on an event that Promundo helped organize 2 weeks ago. And Sarah, if you'll pass to the next slide. 2 weeks ago, we launched a study with partners in Ramallah, Palestine about men and masculinities and how much they participate in family life. And a piece of that was a launch of a photo exhibit of men doing the hands-on caregiving and some quotes from women and men of what their fathers meant to them. And before the event, I was reflecting with a photographer who had taken the pictures, and we both commented on, isn't it strange that we have to call out and call special attention to what men should be doing anyway? That the daily hands-on care of children by men should not be something strange or out of the ordinary. It should simply be normal. And how much we also felt a deep sense of worry that women do this work every day. In fact, they do on global average 3 times the amount of it. And we often don't count it, take pictures of it, celebrate it. We simply assume it's there. And then the photographer told me something that also resonated to me, which is he said many of the mothers, the women, partners of these men did not want the pictures shown, because in some Arab cultures, there's a worry that you don't share your blessings or your bounty with others because they'll covet it. The whole origin of that evil eye that will covet something rare and special that you have. And I thought, well, wasn't this also a challenge, that we consider good men doing hands-on caregiving to be something so rare and special that you would want it hidden away so that others don't covet it? And I think as I listened to Ron's starting words of saying, what we want with caring men, what we ultimately want with this simply is normal. It is not that we want to forget about it or give it less attention, but our real goal at the end of this is that men's care of others and children, men's ability to connect to others is simply so normal as, the water that we expect to come from our tap and the air around us that we breathe. The next slide, please. I think it's important to say, why does this matter so much? It matters a huge amount in this Me Too moment, but it has mattered for a very long time, forever, in terms of gender equality and inequality. I think it's fair to say that the division of who does what in our world, the belief that women and girls are the innate caregivers and men should be in the outside world conquering and producing and making things, is really ultimately at the root of the gender binary and gender inequality. It is the driver of why we tell our sons to go outside and compete, and that the world outside the home is where important things happen, and to be tough and to don't look back and to run ahead into the world, while we often tell our daughters, stay closer to home, we must keep you safe, you must be docile. This is the beginning of where we send very powerful messages to our developing children of what we consider important and what we consider male and female roles. And in doing so with both men and women, with both boys and girls, we stifle parts of ourselves. We tell our daughters to doubt their voices, to not be assertive, to not show anger, to not be forthright, to wonder if the world outside is really a place that's safe for them or that they're good enough to be in it. And we tell our sons to tough it up, that the important things happen not where we do the daily hands-on care of each other and the concern for our own bodies, but to be worried about the outside world where we've got to compete and show how tough and how strong, and instead of showing how connected we are to others, to show how much we can go it alone. So I think as we understand where gender equality ultimately stems from, this belief that the outside world is important and the less value given to what we do in the home in terms of the care of others is really at the root of what we now are talking about in women's economic empowerment, and the fact that women's income is about 20% lower than men's, and that we think, according to the World Economic Forum, that it will take us 180 years to achieve equality. This is where it starts in terms of how we divide the world. The next slide, please. And the key issue as we think now in this moment of Me Too is to understand the linkages of men's caregiving and violence and how we prevent violence. We know from research that we've carried out now with 60,000 men and women around the world as part of a study called the International Men and Gender Equality Survey, that for an individual boy, let's take this boy with the spiky hair, the single driver of whether he will use violence against a female partner if he is a heterosexual young man in a relationship later on is if he saw a man in his household use violence. Many other factors matter, but that turns out to be the single largest driver. Did he learn and expect that violence by men against women is a normal thing? Or did he come to see that his connection and concern and empathy with others is what manhood and human and womanhood is about? Did he see a cycle of violence that started watching what his father or another man did? Or did he see his father radically connected to him as a caregiver, as important as other caregivers in the home? We know from that same data that men who witness violence growing up don't do as much of the hands-on care. They are pushed away from that. They don't see it as something that men do. We know that daughters growing up in these same households with violence are more likely to gravitate toward violent relationships. That is, they're likely to come to see violence as normal. We know that daughters that have involved caring fathers are less likely to have early unwanted sexual violent experiences. So we know just how much telling men that we expect from you hands-on daily involvement in caregiving as a disruptor of violence. And I think as we look at this Me Too moment, there are men and boys around the world looking for, what do we need men to do? I think a lot of the discussion of men being in silence about it is because we've spent a lot of years telling men what you shouldn't do, which we have to continue to do. But I think we've not done enough to say what we expect of you, what we model for you of what caring, empathetic, connected versions of manhood look like. Try Googling those and finding those on the internet compared to how many images you can find of men's use of violence every single day. So I do want to think in that Me Too moment, I suppose what I'd like to leave as a message that we take forward is to say it's not only about what we tell our sons not to do. It is what our sons see us doing every single day. Do they see us as caregivers, or do they see us as transmitters of violence? It's also important to talk about the content of fatherhood, because as we know that a father can be very involved but pass on a message that tolerates violence. Let us think of the father of the Stanford athlete who sexually assaulted a woman on campus, and his father before the judge said his son should receive a light sentence because that drunken incident shouldn't ruin his son's life. We can't consider that involved in caring fatherhood. So I want to say that it matters hugely what fathers do in being involved in their children's lives, but it matters the content, not simply that they're present. The next one, please. The issue, if I haven't convinced you so far, we've got more data, I could bring it out, but I think I'm making the point that no matter where we look and how we look, men's equitable caregiving pays forward. I just mentioned the ways it pays forward in terms of less violence. Our research and other research from across Europe and North America and elsewhere finds that in households where men do a greater amount of the caregiving, women report they're happier and men report they're happier as individuals in the context of heterosexual households. It's also important that they say they're happier overall with the relationship. Whether those relationships last longer or break up, for the moment, when women and men report that there's greater equality in the hands-on caregiving in the context of a heterosexual relationship, couples say they're happier. We also know there's an association with couples having the children they want. That is, that children enter the world having been wanted and planned when there's a greater participation by men in an equitable amount of the caregiving. It goes even further. We've got data, my colleague Øystein Holter, who's a researcher at the University of Oslo and has looked at homicide and public security data from across North America and Europe, finds that in looking at more than 50 European countries, and about 20 US states, those states and European countries where there's greater gender equality, which includes greater equality of men's caregiving, have consistently lower rates of homicide, lower rates of suicide, lower rates of depression. So we can see even a societal impact where men do our fair and equitable share of the hands-on caregiving. There is a ripple effect, and we can show with data the kinds of things Ron was saying in the introduction about what happens when we have enough caring men that we achieve a threshold, that we really can revert some of the broader violence issues that we're talking about. Again, not by itself, but together with the other things we need, it pays forward in multiple ways. The next slide, please. A myth that we often have to encounter in a lot of discussions that I'll do with parents, and I'm sure others, is, well, my sons and daughters, they're just different. We come out of the womb different. Yes, there are biological bases to how we are as men and women. There are small hormonal and biological differences, and there's a big difference in women's ability to carry a child. But those differences pale compared to how we raise children. Our biological makeup of men and women leaves us capable for harm or capable of connection. There's an amazing amount of research that's coming out now showing that men who are in close contact with young children, their own or others, have hormonal shifts. We have, as part of our biological makeup as males, we have testosterone, but we also have the hormones that are, we often call them women's hormones or female hormones. that allow us to focus on something close to us, that actually slow down our metabolism a bit so we're focused not on external stimuli, but this young child in front of us who needs our attention. The bottom line that this research is affirming for us, we as men have the epigenetic capacity. That means we have it as part of our systems, our biological makeup, to be hands-on caregivers, and our bodies respond in kind. Just as women raised in or provoked in violent settings have testosterone that can come out. So I think what this points to is that our commonalities as women and men, our biological capacity to be caregivers is tremendous. We are not teaching boys to do something they didn't know how to do. Boys came into the world able to be caregivers. What we often do is beat it out of them. So I think what we're trying to say is this is about giving boys and men back their capacity to care in the connected, loving ways that we absolutely can. Just as our work to empower women and girls says, we want to let you have the voice, the assertiveness, the agency that you deserve and have a birthright to as well. The next one, please. My last point is the what do we do about men? A lot of our discussions with men around Me Too and elsewhere is really about sort of holding individual men accountable or the push toward individual men. And even our constructions of masculinity is that he can do it on his own. Just get better, just you as an individual. And it's not to say that we don't need to hold individual men accountable for the harm they cause or their lack of support for equality, whether it's Harvey Weinstein or heads of state that we could easily name. Yes, we need to hold individual men accountable for their actions. But the issue of achieving full equality in men's caregiving is about changing the world around men. So whether it's the health provider shown here, if she looks up at the man and calls him by his name or says, hey, if she asks him a question, if she includes him in that, we know that that does a far more than simply a poster that says, hey man, do your duty and be part of a prenatal visit. It is the world around men that we must change with equitable parental leave that says, with a boss who says, it's not I'm asking you, are you going to take leave? It's a boss who says, hey, Cole, I know that you and your partner are adopting a child. I'm expecting you're going to take the leave. I'm going to have the head of our HR get in touch with you about the benefits that we offer as an employer. It is about making it obvious that we expect men to have work-life balances, to do the hands-on caregiving, that our child care centers have men and women, that our care professions have men and women modeling every single day that we as a world value this as a profession, we value it as what is part of our human capacity. Just as one final anecdote, and then I'll end. About 8 years ago, we did a study that we called the Men Who Care Study. And in 5 countries around the world, we did qualitative interviews with men who are doing a greater than average amount of the daily caregiving of their children, or were in professions in their countries that were considered women's caregiving professions. And we listened to those nearly 100 stories of men from around the world, India, Latin America, Northern Europe, South Africa. And the very common point was, all these men said, I see how my family in particular appreciates that I do this. They need it. It's a motor for the family. We couldn't get along as a family if we didn't do it. But they also said how lonely they felt and how forgotten they felt and how they felt everyone took for granted their caregiving. And I thought back to my mother, who was mostly a stay-at-home caring for myself and my 2 siblings and foster children who came through, of just how much the daily caregiving is not appreciated no matter who else does it or who does it. The other thing these men said is, in spite of that, they felt that they became better men when they did this. They were more emotionally receptive, their relationships got better, their friendships got deeper, they paid more attention to their own mental health and their own health. And I was inspired that a few of them said it didn't make them better men, it made them better human beings. And I think ultimately that is what we're after, that it's not caring men, it is simply that we make caregiving human. We no longer call it male or female, it is simply what we all need. And with that, I want to end because I'm really curious to hear what Riane has to say about this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gary. We'll go now to you, Riane. Let me make sure you're unmuted so we can hear you here.
That would be good.
There you are. Great.
Well, thank you so much, Ron and Gary and Sarah. I'm going to take off from where Gary really stopped, which is changing the world around men. And I'm going to propose to you that actually a major way to do that, because everything is interactive, it isn't just these one-way causes and effects, is to really re-examine and leave behind our old gender stereotypes. And I want to start here with a couple of questions, which I think many of you may have asked at some point. Could I have the next slide? Why are boys taught that their identity is defined as not being like a woman, as not being female, in other words, in negative terms? And why is, quote, besting each other the way boys are taught to express masculinity? And I'm going to suggest to you that to answer these questions really requires that we shift our frame, that we no longer think of masculinity and femininity in the ways that we've been taught about it as, quote, just gender issues or just women's issues, as we're often told, but as key social issues. Because if you really think about it, think about it. There are two halves of humanity. Can I have the next slide, please? They're called women and they're called men. And so how we socialize children isn't just this, peripheral gender issue, the way we've been taught about it. It's a core human, economic, and social issue. Now, we've been taught to really, Gary brought this out so beautifully, to split our humanity into, quote, feminine and into, quote, masculine. And of course, this deprives both halves of humanity, both forms, there are two basic forms of humans, female and male, of their full humanity. It, as Gary's brought out so well, it certainly deprives, this not being like a woman, right, deprives men of their capacities to express their capacities, because they're wired into us for caring, for empathy, for sensitivity, at the same time that, as Gary also brought out, it deprives the female half of humanity of their capacity to be assertive, to lead. And it's a mess, isn't it, to do that? And so we really need a different frame. Because in the old social categories, right versus left, religious versus secular, Eastern versus Western, gender just doesn't even appear, right? It's not even part of the conversation. And that is really, a colleague of mine has called these old categories weapons of mass distraction. Why? Because they leave out the relationships that are fundamental, parent-child relations, and yes, gender relations, the relations that children first experience and observe, that have such an enormous impact on nothing less than how our brains develop. Now, we can see the effects of this stereotypical gender socialization for, quote, masculinity in our current United States president who is trying to gut all caring policies, who wants to establish institutions that give him enormous power over others, enormous control, who's obsessed with winning, right? With besting others. And yes, who really has expressed quite clearly his contempt for the so-called feminine, for women, and who has also expressed that he sees half of humanity, the half of humanity that really, I mean, that is the twin, the male twin, is just instrumental, as sort of sexual objects. Now, none of this is coincidental. Can I have the next slide, please? And I'm going to suggest to you that the contemporary questioning of stereotypical gender roles is nothing less than questioning what it means to be human, which is, of course, what Gary also brought out. And that this has powerful implications not only for our lives within families, but for all aspects of our lives, from the spiritual and the sexual, yes, to economics and politics. Next slide. Now, I said we have to change our frame, because as long as we operate with these social categories, right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern, that simply ignore the centrality of socialization of both girls and boys, we are really always distracted from a key component. So I'm going to give you just, at the speed of light here, a tour of, and could you please start putting in thank you very much, of the difference of what I've identified through my multidisciplinary, cross-cultural research over decades now as the configuration of a domination system versus a partnership system. Categories that transcend the old categories, because if you really think of the old categories, right, left, etc., you've had horrible, oppressive, violent regimes in all these categories. So it's time we start thinking of what kind of a social system supports our human capacities for caring, for empathy, for sensitivity, the capacities for creativity, rather than for destructiveness, for violence, for cruelty, etc. And that's where we come to these new categories. And of course, in the domination system, you have rigid hierarchies of control, power over, superior-inferior relations. Yes, the only alternatives people are given is you either dominate or you're dominated. There is no partnership alternative. And of course, you rank men over women, and yes, the socially constructed masculinity over the socially constructed stereotype of femininity. In the partnership system, you still have hierarchies. We need parents, we need teachers, we need managers, leaders, but they're flexible hierarchies of actualization that empower rather than disempower. Power to and power with, relations of mutual respect, accountability that's mutual, rather than just, accountability from inferior to so-called superior. Nurturing and sustaining life is a top priority. And yes, gender partnership and the valuing of caring, caregiving, and nonviolence are huge. And they're valued in women, men, and social policy, and social and economic policy. And this is where you begin to sort of connect the dots between what we've been taught to think of, well, it's just a gender issue, and what happens in society and in the world at large. Next, please. Can I have the next slide? Thank you. Now, the problem, and it's a huge problem, is that during much of recorded history, which has oriented more to the domination side, in fact, very much so. If you think, for example, of the European Middle Ages, it looked a lot like the Taliban, right? Inquisition, crusades, witch burnings. Historically, fiscal priorities have followed gendered values, and we've got to become aware of this. So we know today that where women are devalued, so-called masculine priorities become fiscal priorities, and you have higher investment in weapons, wars, prison. Where women are highly valued, for example, we see movement in this direction quite visibly in some of the nations that Gary mentioned, Sweden, Finland, Norway. So-called feminine priorities, caring for people, caring for nature, become fiscal priorities. And of course, you had then a higher investment in care for humans and for nature. Next slide, please. Now, the problem is that we really, and by the way, what I just showed you really is verified by statistical studies. We did a study like that at the Center for Partnership Studies, analyzing data from 89 nations, showing that the status of women is a powerful predictor of everyone's quality of life. And since then, other studies, for example, the World Economic Forum's gender gap reports, have verified this, showing, that nations such as Sweden, Norway, Finland, where the status of women, they have the lowest gender gaps. Okay, they still have some, but they're lower. That these nations regularly appear also in the World Economic Forum's global competitiveness reports in the high ranks. So it's not only quality of life, but it's also economic success. Next slide, please. Now, so today we know what Gary has been talking about. Caring is a human value. Next slide. But the problem, and this is really what the subject of my book, The Real Wealth of Nations, addresses in some detail, that the domination-based economic systems we've inherited basically make the work of care invisible, because they came out of, they came out of early industrial times, but they also, and today we're in the post-industrial knowledge service age. So on that count alone, both capitalism and socialism are antiquated, but it's beyond that. They came out of more rigid domination times. So for both Adam Smith and for Karl Marx, they saw the work of caring for people, this fundamental work without which none of us would be here, without which there would be nothing. They saw it as just reproductive rather than, quote, productive work. Next slide, please. But, we still are teaching this in economic schools today. And I actually want to ask every one of you to begin to really call this out, to change it, and to teach in economic schools what we today know, that there are today empirical studies showing that if the work of caring for people, the unpaid household work of caring for people, were included in the reported GDP, it would constitute 30 to 50% of the GDP, depending on what method you use, whether it's just a market value, and of course, market value of care work is low, or whether it's, if you also take into account the opportunity cost. Anyway, I won't go into that, we don't have time. But next slide. So that's why we at the Center for Partnership Studies launched the Caring Economy campaign. And I want to invite all of you to really become active participants in this. Keep doing whatever you're doing, but also focus on gender, focus on how we've had a gendered system of values and therefore an uncaring system of values running, animating our economic policies. And we need to shift to what I call a caring economy. And what does that mean? First of all, policies that support caregiving in both women and men, paid parental leave. Certainly, we should have caregiver tax credits. I mean, there's a whole slew of economic inventions that we can and have proposed. Certainly, investment in early childhood. We know today that especially for our knowledge service post-industrial era, when automation, robotics, artificial intelligence are replacing so many jobs as we defined, quote, productive, right? That whether or not this high quality human capital that economists keep telling us we must have in our post-industrial era is or is not going to be produced largely depends on the quality of care and the quality of early childhood education. And instead, in our country, we are gutting this rather than improving it, which takes me to something vital, which we need new measures of economic health. And we at the Center for Partnership Studies have developed what we call social wealth economic indicators that, yes, that show the economic value of the work of caring for people and caring for nature, which are not part of either capitalist or socialist theory. Next slide, please. So I want to close with an example of how policy, I mean, we tend to sort of think only of what happens to the individual, and then there is the social, the political, the economic, but they're interconnected, and it's up to us, it's up to human agency to change our social policies. In other words, as Gary said, changing the world around both men and women and children of both genders. And in Canada, just a small change in policy, making it, quote, normal and expected for fathers to take parental leave, not only increased the number of men taking paternity leave, it also increased their daily time in household work by 23%. And this effect lasted long after the leave period ended. So we're talking about enormous personal and family effects. Next slide, please. But we're also talking about enormous social and political and economic effects if we are serious about moving to that more caring, more equitable, more sustainable future. We cannot keep splitting off gender from the importance, quote unquote, stuff. So I invite you to learn more from these two websites, from reading, and for understanding what we started with, that these so-called gender issues are key social, political, and economic issues. I thank you.
So, Ron, let's go back to you, and perhaps you can open up some further conversation between Gary and Riane.
Yes, and thank you, Sarah, and Riane and Gary. How do we make these big ideas, these awesome ideas that you've shared, how do we make them work? How do we put them into practice?
Are you asking me? I'll go first.
Yes.
I think we are putting them into practice. I think the work that Gary and Promundo and the so-called men's studies and the so-called women's studies, which it's kind of ridiculous because we didn't even have those until just a few decades ago. We are moving, but we're moving much too slowly. And one of the ways that I see from my work, from my research, and from my activism, and from traveling all over the world. I mean, I just came back from Chile, speaking at a conference there about the future, sponsored by the president of Chile, who happens to be female, Michelle Bachelet. I mean, she's going out now, but she's done tremendous work. Is to really understand the importance of getting rid of, leaving behind these straitjackets, really, for both halves of humanity and for society and for economics and for politics, of these gender stereotypes that are really designed to maintain domination systems, where you have these top-down rankings starting with the equating of the most fundamental difference in our species between male and female forms with superiority or inferiority, dominating or being dominated, being served or serving. And you can then, and we see that everywhere, we can apply it to a different race, to a different religion. You know, it's not only the racism of the United States, but it's Shia versus Shia, you know, versus Sunni, Sunni versus Shia. It's a product of the domination systems, and gender stereotypes is something we have to really focus on changing.
I would echo that and say all the above. I mean, it is thinking about all the spaces and places where families in particular get their messages and get their services. So it's a healthcare system. First, we have to offer healthcare and make it accessible to all, but that we move away from maternal and child and say family health. We need men there as well, assuming there's not violence going on, but we need to make it obvious to have men in the door at prenatal visits, present during birth, present there to care for their children and for their own health. We need schools teaching this. Nothing like seeing boys be obligated to do some voluntary, quote unquote, time in a daycare center, for example. Watch how that changes an equation of how boys see themselves and see what's normal. The workplace policies that we talked about, the presumption of equal pay, a presumption, the opt-out model in Canada that says we assume you'll take leave when you become a parent. Work-life possibilities that say, let's provide on-site childcare, let's give breaks so that families have the time off that they need. Sports figures, sports spaces that say competition matters, but also caring and connection, and women and men can do this equally. Media, we need brands like Dove, Men Plus Care, Procter & Gamble have done some really interesting commercials lately showing men doing actually, you know, household cleaning and caring, not presuming that women do this forever and ever and ever. Childcare, making that a profession that's not presumed to be the low-paid women, but that it's a well-paid for all profession that our sons could equally aspire to do, and that it's not a leftover profession that we maybe remember to pay and pay poorly when we even think to pay it. And I think, you know, while if we can get a cycle of things like that going, these changes can work fairly quickly. Riane mentioned the example from Canada. You know, this is not really tough to nudge men toward doing things that bring them immediate benefits. Happier, longer, healthier lives when men do this. Families get it, children thrive. So I think if we can get it going in enough places, intensely enough, it starts to show benefits pretty soon. And for those who are politicians thinking about votes, watch what's happening in Western Europe, particularly the Scandinavians or the Nordic countries, where even if they move to the right, no one is proposing taking away paid parental leave that is, at least on paper, equal for mothers and fathers. So I think, you know, a couple of wise politicians might also look and say, fancy that, families actually like these services and they'll vote for me if I offer them.
Well, and
I like that.
I second that.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned media, which I think is one of the very important messengers, if you will, in our society. And you talked about advertisers. What about the motion picture industry, the recording industry? How can they help facilitate the change in attitudes and behavior?
Yeah. I think there are interesting places, the Gina Davis Institute, Common Sense Media. There's certainly a lot of conversation lately with the Oscars and the BAFTAs and the rest of where is women's representation, where's the representation of different minorities. I think we are hyper-tuned as we should be for looking at women's voices and full equality for women in such spaces. Gina Davis likes to say, if she can see it, she can be it. I don't know if we're doing as much that says, if he can see it, he can be it. So that there might be fewer terminators and a few more childcare workers and involved fathers who aren't the butt of jokes. Because often our imagery of the involved father, there's some great ones, but he's either celebrated as like this, this amazing super dad that few of us can live up to, or he's the bumbling father, or he's the violent guy who gets, who's hyper masculine, hyper heterosexual, gets all the attractive women and continues to, his body never breaks down. So I think we've also got a model in media, not only what we want to see women's voices and women's spaces for all they deserve, but the flip side of this is we've got to create spaces for boys and men to see more caring, complex, multi-hormonal, not single hormonal men on the screen.
And I want to add to that the trend to have sort of female superheroes who basically become, they take over the male masculine stereotype is not the answer.
Yeah.
I mean, what you're talking about is fundamental, isn't it? And we come right back to it. What kind of values? What do we really value?
Ron, let me turn a question to you. I know something of your personal history, and you've had multiple challenges in terms of sons and now grandchildren, and kind of how do you model involved fathering and juggle that together with your quite intense career, and even as a man who's had a career that says I care about what happens to women's lives in terms of defending women against violence against women. How do you live that? Because this sounds really good as we talk about it on a webinar, but we know that the challenge is when we turn the camera off and really try to live this. I don't know if you want to offer any reflections on some of your personal stories of how you've tried to live and model this for your sons and grandsons and daughters and granddaughters.
Well, I've been, my life is really sort of many pieces of a jigsaw puzzle finally coming together into finding my calling, which is this work. But my first marriage, I tried, and so did my former husband, to fit these stereotypes. I was going to be the little woman behind the great man, right?
Yeah.
And it was a disaster. For both of us. My second marriage, and I didn't want to get married, by the way, I lived with my present husband for 10 years because this husband-wife thing carried so much of, especially in my generation, so much luggage. But I finally got it, that what I needed was a man who was a true human. And I got one. And so I've been very, very blessed with David Loy, my husband, who, by the way, is deconstructing Darwin, showing that Darwin has been interpreted as this 800-pound gorilla for the domination system, whereas actually in his work, well, why don't you pick up a book called Rediscovering Darwin, and you can find out about it. But it's hard. It's hard to model. I think that what we do model, both my husband and I, are two people who intensely love each other, who are very caring, who have warts and all, and faults, and who don't do everything completely the way it should be done, but who can also both have their calling, their work outside the home as well as their work in the home. And I think that is a very, very important thing for both boys and girls to see. And of course, to see a caring man. like my husband, I think is very important also. But my grandchildren have been blessed that their fathers too are caring men.
All right.
And so, uh, you know, but it is like swimming against the tide.
Yeah.
And that's why we have to change the tide. And the tide are how we think about gender and the kind of policies we have. Elevating paid parental leave is not, well, we'll think about that after the more important things, realizing that it is a very, very key, important thing in terms of a more humane and sustainable world.
Yeah. Ron, LeGrand, you also live these issues every day. Would love to hear your story on these challenges with sons and grandsons and the like.
Thank you, Gary. Yes, like too many men, I grew up without my father. All right, I didn't have that role model. I didn't have someone to show me how to be a man, how to be a father, how to be a parent. All right, and correction, I had my mom, and I have to give her all credit and recognition for that, because too often there's the belief that a woman, a mother, cannot teach a boy how to be a man. And that's not true, and I believe that I'm living proof of that. My 6 sons will tell you that their father's first commandment is, "Thou shalt respect thy mother." And it's based on the belief that as long as you do that, you will treat girls and women in your life with respect. And so all of my sons, who are now adults, 2 of them are fathers. One is raising 3 of his children as a single parent, 2 sons and a daughter. And he is giving them the love and caring and nurturing and affection and support that I celebrate. I'm proud of him. I'm humbled by him and what he is doing. Having just turned 31, his oldest child just turned 12. My granddaughter just turned 10. And the youngest child is still 4. My son Brian is raising all 3 of them. My son Aaron is married and raising his son, and they are doing a fabulous job. Raising my sons, I taught them there is no such thing as women's work. You do the work around the house. Each one of you had a chore. I love cooking, and I taught each one of them how to cook, and they are very good cooks. My oldest is a chef at the University of Vermont Hospital. They are fantastic men. And they understood early on that there's no shame, no dishonor in showing love and caring and affection. To this day, when we get together, there's an embrace. And there's this neighborhood of guys who grew up with them and who have each individually been adopted by me. And so they know when we see each other, it's like, don't just stand there, get over here. There's an embrace, okay? We're talking about men now who are in their 30s and early 40s, who are not ashamed. Some have become single fathers, unwed fathers, and they made the right decision to be present, not only financially in the lives of their children, but actively as caregivers. That's how we do this. We model the behavior. You know, it is be the change that you want to see in the world. And that's what we do. That's what my sons do. My second youngest informed me 2 weeks ago that he and his fiancée just learned that they were expecting. And it was a bit of a surprise. Now, he is not my biological son. His mother said to him, "Be a better father than your biological father was." And he said to me, "Dad, I'm going to be good to my son, to my child." And I told him, you begin being good by treating your fiance with love, support, and respect. Because what you do will be communicated to that child that's in her womb. And you enhance the chances, the opportunities for that child to come into this world happy and at peace. Yeah. That's when it begins. I could go on and on about my sons, but I won't. I'll spare all of you that.
Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you so much, Ron. That's so beautiful. It made me think of what Gandhi said. Let's not mistake for normal what is habitual. And we have to leave some bad habits behind. That's what this all is about. Habits of thinking, habits of acting, and it can be done. And you are an exemplar of how to do it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ron, did you have some other other questions for Gary and Riane, or shall we move to taking some questions from our attendees, our wonderful participants?
I've seen a bit of chat activity. I think we should open it up to our attendees.
All right. Well, thank you for your great questions and for sharing your story. So just a reminder to everyone that I've been actually capturing questions as we've gone along that have already come up in the chat, but please don't hesitate to add to that list. Because of the numbers of people on the call, we are sorry that we won't be able to take every single question, but we will take a selection of them as time permits. And really look forward to addressing the questions that you all have been raising along the way. I think Ron's comments in some way sort of touched on this first question already, but this was a question that came up even as Gary, you were doing your opening remarks about perhaps saying a little bit more about how boys are affected by single parent homes. And Ron's personal experience sort of spoke directly to that, but is there more that you could add to that question, given the importance that you've placed on men modeling caring, assuming that most single parent homes are headed by women?
Yeah, I think what we can say is that it matters a huge amount that boys can see caring, nonviolent men around them. That doesn't have to be in their immediate nuclear family. That can be teachers and coaches and brothers and uncles and nephews or cousins and all the like. So we have to be careful that we don't, I think Ron's story is quite telling. And I remember doing some of my first doctoral work in Chicago, and a young man, when I asked him who did he look to as his male role model, and he said, my mom is my male role model. I think we have to be careful that we don't reinforce the binary with some of this. But yes, it is common that boys will look to, so what does it mean to be a man? And if that seems unsure, the most salient, loudest voices out there will be the ones. One of the reasons we think from a developmental point of view that 3-year-old, 4-year-old, 5-year-old boys love to run around in capes as superheroes is that as a 3-year-old, 4-year-old boy, you're kind of told that, well, you see that everybody's bigger than you. And you look around and think, oh, I see that those who are bigger get their way. They show their dominance over others. So I'm going to pretend that I can be one of those little superheroes as well. Girls may do that, but that seems even more something we build into boys. So it matters that we help boys with some icons and some models and some references that are male and in positive ways. In the long run, as we get older, we come to see that those differences become somewhat less important in terms of how we define ourselves. So I think it's important that, yes, boys do have the chance to see folks who call themselves male and that they can find those positive connections in themselves, not just based on competition and domination. But I think it's also true that we want boys and girls to kind of see that it's only a piece of our identity, is whether we're male or female or of another sexual orientation or gender identity. That in fact, bigger things are we good at a particular skill? Are we contributing to the world? Is it some cultural skill that we're good at? that I find that as I get older and that, many individuals that I look up to, that male and female become less important for their identity and lots of other things matter more. So clearly that's not where a lot of 4-year-old boys will be or a lot of 14-year-old girls, that we do need to reinforce positive ways of being male and female. But over the lifespan, I think we want to help all adults feel like it's more important my humanity than my masculinity, or my humanity than my femininity. So yes, it matters, but let's not overplay it.
I would agree with Gary, and go on, Riane.
No, I was going to say, I so agree, because we're right back to what I was talking about, which is being human, which is being a complete human that encompasses both the positive qualities of masculinity. Assertiveness is supposed to be masculine. Well, it's human. Women can be assertive without being called ball breakers and all of that. But I think that there's a piece we need to understand in terms of what I've studied, which is social dynamics, psychosocial dynamics, which is that only as the status of women rises can men embrace the so-called feminine. That this is a transitional period where we have to, like in the Nordic nations, women are half of the national legislatures. What that meant was that not only women voted for paid parental leave, for caring policies, for early childhood education, but men also did, because it was no longer such a threat to their, quote, masculinity, to their, quote, identity, to be more like a woman, because being a woman was a good thing now. She was having a position of status, of authority. You see what I'm talking about? I think that we, as much as we need to focus on changing how men see themselves, we also have to focus on how men see femininity as not being something inferior, that as being something that is part of them. But it only happens as the status of women rises. We wouldn't be having this conversation even 50 years ago, when people in this country used to say, gee, can you imagine, hope next time it's a boy when a baby was born.
Yeah.
It's only as the status of women has risen. And I think these are the dynamics. This is why I harp on a set of social categories that show the importance of how gender roles and relations are socially constructed.
Ron, did you want to chime in on this as well? Oh, Ron, you might be frozen there. Wonder if we've lost your live feed. Well, hopefully he'll find his way back into action. Sorry, that looks like maybe there was a gap in his internet connection. But I think what you're just both talking about, Gary and Riane, leads really nicely into a question that we got from Bonnie, who says that she's observed that for reasons she thinks she understands, it seems to be more difficult for men to embrace the feminine than it has been for women who have worked now for decades to embrace more of the masculine or qualities that we consider feminine or masculine. And she wonders if this means that it will make it more difficult to make this shift to a caring masculinity than it was perhaps over recent decades to make the shift into normalizing women in positions of leadership, for example. Yeah.
Riane, should I start, or you want to start? Or
Please go ahead.
I do think that we could credit World War II, that sent men off and created space, at least in parts of Europe and the US, to step into positions that we considered men's jobs before. So historical moments can matter to say we as a world need women to do something different. I think that was one historical landmark that mattered a huge amount in small ways in other parts of the world. where the world says we need women doing something for our countries for a particular moment in crisis that can shift in big ways. And I think the women's rights movement deserves a huge amount of work for saying women can do all these things that men can do. And we've created slowly a social space that says we want our daughters to be at the table. We want to take them to work. We want them in STEM professions. We have deliberately and with very good reason created a space that says we want to create a world where our daughters have full equality with our sons. I think we've not had the equivalent revolution for men and boys. I mean, how many folks can name, we can all probably name what STEM stands for. Not many folks know that there's an analogous thing called HEAL, referring to health and education, arts and learning professions, of how do we think about boys and men into professions that we normally think of as women, as women's professions. How have we created spaces where we've got Wonder Woman? Do we have the equivalent of, a man being a super hyper-connected, caregiving, empathetic individual? I'm not sure if we do, if it's made the airwaves the same way. And I do think as long as we continue to measure masculinity by performance-oriented, by I'm a provider, I'm a worker, and everything else is secondary, it becomes really difficult to say other things are just as important to be a man. So yes, I think in some ways the standards that we hold masculinity mean that it is tough for men to move into that space. And we have a whole slew of language and words that go far beyond kind of the tomboy equivalent for girls who transgress the norm. They really are kind of stripping boys of manhood. You're not a real man if you don't do those things. And so I think we've got a lot of work there to create that space for boys and men that say, this version of manhood is really stuck and we've got to bust it open. So I agree. I think it is a bit more difficult. It doesn't mean to say the first women who stepped into leadership positions and those who are still trying to break into it, ask Hillary Clinton, who, if she tried to seem assertive, was called all kinds of things. I mean, it's not somehow easy for women either. But I do agree there's a big space that we need to come up with. I think there's a big space that we've got to come up with for men to be the equivalent of the incomplete but still impressive women's rights revolution that we're starting and seeing fruits of.
And I absolutely agree with you, Gary. And this is why I think that the men's movement that you're part of and the leader in is so vital. I think we have all been conditioned to answer the question, to devalue anything associated with being like a woman.
Yeah.
So one of the reasons that we launched the Caring Economy campaign, why the social wealth economic indicators, is to show the not only human value, but also the economic value of the so-called women's work of caregiving. I think that we have to change our system of values, and that goes along with raising the status of women and changing the roles of both women and men. In my book, The Chalice and the Blade, I looked at our history, and including our prehistory, and found that societies where women also had leadership positions, where the feminine was not just seen as instrumental, but was valued, they were more equitable and more peaceful, which is, of course, what you were talking about when you were talking about the testosterone. And so we're talking about a real revolution here, in which the changes of the valuations of masculine and feminine, women and men are key, and changing these old roles is pivotal.
Yeah, agreed.
Well, another topic that has been very, very lively, as you can well imagine in the chat, relates to religion and the role that religion plays in gender socialization. It looks as though there's some folks who kind of have written off the religious communities as sites of potential change. Other people see possibilities for change there. Both of you have done cross-cultural work, and I know both have looked at religious traditions as playing a role in gender. Could you speak to how you think about each of you, both the role of that religion can play in reinforcing traditional gender, but also perhaps where we might see some leverage points to use religious communities or to work with religious communities around some of the shift to a caring masculinity that we're talking about today.
Yeah.
Gary?
Sure. That's as always the thorny question that comes up and needs to, if we look at, and particularly this moment where in some parts of the world, I would say the US, parts of the Middle East, even a few pockets of Europe, Latin America for sure, where a certain conservative, doctrinaire, more extreme versions of religion are making a comeback. And I think we have to call them that. There are strains of fundamentalism that are winning elections, they're winning hearts and minds, and I think we need to be concerned about them. I think what they also cause us to do is to forget that in all of our big international multi-country religions, so choose our Abrahamic ones or others, that there's multiple strains of thought in them. And so it becomes really difficult when fundamentalism becomes so strong in the room that we want to say, well, there is no moderate Islam. Well, actually, a reading of the Quran, you can find lots of pro-equality, pro-men's involvement, stuff that we would question today, but other things that certainly look quite women's empowerment. And the same you can find in Christian and Judaic texts and other religions. So I do think the first thing that we try to do, and perhaps it's an act of desperation in our work in some settings, is to say that with most fundamentalist views on large religions, there's not really much discourse and much conversation to be had. But if we can find and connect to the more moderate, diverse voices that exist in these religions, we can often find common concern about our humanity, about empathy, about care for the other, as having roots in most religious traditions. It's not easy, but I think that really to be, an optimist is to say, we can find religious leaders who say violence against women is not okay. That equality and inequality and domination of one is not really what we meant, and we're willing to say that, even as there are other aspects that we don't agree with. But I think the most obvious piece is to find the moderate and sometimes progressive and alternative voices that exist, and that often whose voices are drowned out as fundamentalist approaches or views take up more and more of the airwaves.
And I'd like to add here that I think that here is where the lenses of the partnership and domination configurations can really help us sort things out.
Yeah.
Because if you look at so-called religious fundamentalism, it's domination fundamentalism. It really is about very rigid, male superior, female inferior, always a top priority. It is about a theocratic, top-down control. It's about holy wars. I mean, these are elements of the domination system. The book that I would really highly recommend is the book that I wrote called Sacred Pleasure. The subtitle is Sex, Myth, and the Politics of the Body. And I really think that you can find that one of my dreams has been that religious scholars from all denominations would get together, use these templates, look at the scriptures and sort things out. Because right now it's just like the partnership teachings are there in all of the religious traditions, but then there's this overlay that happened during domination history of all of these teachings, like you should beat your wife in the Quran, or, all of these things that really are reflections of domination customs and beliefs.
Yep.
And I see that Ron is back, thank goodness. Hi.
Hi, I'm sorry. I don't have video, but at least I have audio.
You do have video.
Oh, I do?
No,
okay, great.
His video is frozen, but we do hear you.
Hear your voice.
Great.
Oh.
Great.
Okay, great. I had to call in on my phone because something happened with my laptop.
Yeah, I'm afraid
Um,
you got dropped.
mhm.
Speaking of video, I seem to be in the big video, and everybody else is in the little video. What? I don't understand how that. There, Gary. Hello. Now you get center stage. I like that.
I think we have time for one or maybe two more questions, and then we'll give you a chance to sort of offer some closing comments, Gary and Riane. I did want to get to a question that was sent in ahead of time by Steve Brandt, who wanted to see if he could get some conversation about an idea that he has. He says, what would it take to champion the idea that men will be more caring when they have a chance to care about something really bold and exciting? He says, when I was growing up, America was going to the moon. And this creative technological challenge drove men and women to work together rather than separately, to boldly go where they had not gone before. So what similar challenge could men and women rally around today? One that involves both, he says, both sort of physical science and soft sciences. And he has a proposed answer of world peace, and would love to know what you think about this notion that men will be motivated by a big challenge, something that motivates them to personally change while solving the kind of technological challenge that involves sort of the best of who they are creatively and in terms of skill building.
I'd like to just give a very quick response, which is that peace, nonviolence, has been considered feminine rather than masculine. And that if we are going to really focus on world peace, which I mean, who wouldn't want to do that, we have to start with violence in homes. Because that's where children first learn that it's not only normal, but moral to use violence to impose your will on others. And by this, I mean not only violence by men against women, but by parents against children. In other words, let's really connect the dots here.
Sarah, I get goosebumps and spend sleepless nights thinking about that question of how do we, because I think an ethic of care is not simply caring about those around us in our nuclear extended families, because I think that can turn into nationalism and tribalism and all the rest. So I do think, how is it that we help our daughters and sons have a cause like that, that we know what the vacuum looks like and what kind of causes that young people get sucked into if there's not something big like that? I confess that maybe the last moment that I felt particularly optimistic on the planet was about 9 years back when Obama was getting the Nobel Peace Prize. And I was dreaming, I wonder if he's going to use that as a moment to say the biggest cause on our planet right now is the planet, is whether our planet survives, and whether he was going to put the might of the US as the wealthiest the wealthiest country on the planet toward cleaning up and really galvanizing a youth moment. Sadly, that didn't happen. Something called the Afghan War continued on and continues on this day. That's not only his fault, that's much bigger than that. But I do think, and if I'm optimistic again, it's because I watch young people emerging out of Parkland, Florida, and saying the cause for us is not adults saying some worthless prayer while we mourn our classmates, but that we're actually concerned about making the world nonviolent by, yes, let us melt down some guns and get them out of the classroom. So I am encouraged that maybe young people will find it, and so I can sleep after I can't sleep about this when I think it's not only my duty to think of this, that my 20-year-old daughter has 5 ideas that are far better than mine. So I absolutely believe that. I think the cause for men and for women has got to be beyond simply, yes, we want to do right by our families, but I think we've got to think of a care ethic that is far bigger than just me and my own.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to go back to something that Riane said, and I want to talk about corporal punishment, because I think that it is something that we as a society really need to take a second look at and question whether or not it makes any sense. What our children too often are exposed to is violence in the home perpetrated by someone who professes to love them. Yeah. And so they're taught that sometimes in that love, there is this act of violence. There is harm that is inflicted. And I don't think that we've given enough thought to understanding the confusing message that we send. Love equals pain equals hurt. I think we've got to change that dialogue. I think we've got to really question ourselves as parents and understand the lessons that we're teaching our children whenever we inflict corporal punishment upon them.
Yeah. Agreed.
Thank you so much, Ron, for saying that. And I again, I want to go back to Sacred Pleasure, to this book, because this confluence of caring not only with pain, but with coercion
Mm-hmm.
is a terrible thing. And we have to do just what you said.
Mm-hmm.
So we have just about 3 minutes or so remaining in our time together today. And I just wanted to offer Gary and Riane some final moments to sort of let us know what you would like for us to carry forward in terms of next steps, that action that we could take, or just direct us toward the resources you'd most like to steer us toward, whatever you'd like to do in your closing moments here. And maybe Riane, let's switch it up and perhaps have you do that first, and then we'll go to Gary.
No problem. Well, I have devoted my life to really showing what we've been talking about, that we cannot change the world to be a more caring and, yes, less violent place unless we look at socialization of both boys and girls. And so I want to invite all of you to be part of the Caring Economy campaign. Why? Because it's only as we really show the value of this so-called feminine work of care, of caring, that we will have a different system of values, not only in our homes, but in our larger social and planetary homes. And that's what I want to leave you with, is use your agency in all areas of life. And as Gary so beautifully put it, yes, change the world around men, and I would add women around boys and girls.
Maybe just a final comment. So I come out of the child development field, and we ask that question, what is it that children need to thrive? And thrive means individual level and community level and collective level. And one of our gurus in the field, Yuri Bronfenbrenner, who came up with the ecological model, he said children need at least one adult who's crazy about them. And crazy in the sense of putting their interests ahead of putting the interest of the child ahead of their own. And I think as we enjoin men to be to do more of what many are already doing, it's not to set fathers as somehow special. We are average, daily necessary caregivers. And I think as we talk about and call out the need for caring men, it's thinking about caring men as fathers, as part of all other caregivers, multiple caregivers, not just nuclear heterosexual households. We're talking about all kinds of caregiving. And to ultimately realize that it's not about holding fathers up as somehow the magic caregiver who wasn't at the table, but to say we need all kinds of arrangements of caregivers caring for our elderly and our elderly caring for us, that it's not just in that narrow, rigid view of fatherhood that we're talking about. So as we try to help men develop this nascent and amazing ability to care for others, let's break it out of the box in all ways and say, yes, we believe men can do it, and we become more human by doing it. We don't lose anything. In fact, we only have to gain. Riane, thank you for your comments, and Ron for your words of wisdom and example along the way, whether from corporal punishment to living this, to how to raise loving sons. Yeah, thank you. And Sarah, thanks for moderating us and keeping it all together.
And I want to also thank all of you, of course, Gary and Ron and Sarah, and all of you who came to this webinar. I think together we can change the world. The world is our cultures, our stereotypes, they're human creations.
And we can change it. Thank you, Sarah,
Yes,
Gary,
we can.
Riane. And I renew the challenge that I issued at the very beginning, that everyone on this webinar resolve now to continue this conversation. Don't let this be a one-time conversation. Continue it, share it within and without your circles.
Well, that is a perfect closing for today. Those of you watching can expect to receive a follow-up email within about 24 hours with a link to the recording of this that you can share with your friends and colleagues as part of the work that Ron has challenged us to do in terms of making this just a starting point of this broader conversation. We thank you for your excellent questions and comments throughout. If we had 3 times as much time, we would never have gotten to as many wonderful questions as you all were posing. So thank you so much for your engagement. We wish you well in the rest of your day and the rest of the week to come. Thanks so much.